It's been over. But they had some more art, I guess.
Right.
We're having a little trouble getting our rowdy crowd settled here tonight. So will just be a moment before the latecomers will be seated. Okay. Good evening, and thank you all for joining us, whether it's here in person or by Zoom. I'm Kate Markert, Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C. My pronouns are she and her. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge, as I always do, the Nacotch tank, also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. And these are the native peoples on whose ancestral lands Hillwood now stands, as well as the diverse native communities who make their homes near us today. Now, for those of you joining us by Zoom, please make yourselves comfortable. Your cameras and microphones are not active. You can always submit questions using the Q&A module whenever they cross your mind, and we will get to as many of everybody's questions, whether from Zoom or from here in the room, at the end. Now, for those of you in the theater, I think you know what I'm going to say. Please make sure all of your devices are silenced. Thank you. Much appreciated. It's always bittersweet to reach the end of a lecture series, especially this one. I have so enjoyed seeing everyone who has come in person and hearing from all of these fantastic experts each week. I am eager to end this series on a real high note, learning more about Jay Jaxon tonight. And it won't be long before we can gather again on Wednesday, November the 9th. We're thrilled to welcome Sarah Schloening, who is our Frederick J. Fisher lecturer, and she will discuss the Dallas Museum of Art's exhibition, Cartier and Islamic Art in Search of Modernity. You do not want to miss that one. It is Wednesday, November the 9th. And of course, such an exhibition had to feature Marjorie Post's extraordinary emerald brooch. Of course. Though it's hard to believe, and maybe it's not hard to believe, Thanksgiving and the holidays are really coming right up, and I hope you'll join us on Friday, November 11th. Amy Wilbur is having a virtual floral workshop called Bountiful Harvest. I don't know if you haven't ever participated in that. She's our floral designer here. She's brilliant. And you can either just watch it like TV, which I do, or many of you buy the materials, and I believe there may be a few of the materials left if you're quick. And then you can follow her along at home and actually make, one of these absolutely spectacular creations. But anyway, that's Friday, November 11th. Then beginning Tuesday, November 22nd, that's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, you can come and see Hillwood's holiday decorations, including, as you all know, always a magnificent tree here in the Visitor Center and then 4 stunning trees in the mansion. I won't say any more. I will tell you more about that later. It's really cool this year, just saying. But if you're not a member, of course, there are probably very few of you who are not members, but if you aren't, I invite you to join today and receive a sneak peek at our upcoming programs, as well as a discount in the shop, really important, and the cafe. You can join online and learn more about Hillwood's many other really fabulous offerings, of course, at hillwoodmuseum.org. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Darnell-Jamal Lisby joined the Cleveland Museum of Art in 2021. A fashion historian, his charge is to develop projects rooted in fashion studies that range across the museum's various curatorial departments. Darnell has a thorough understanding of the broader history of fashion dating back to the 14th century, but his particular focus is illuminating the intersection of Blackness and fashion studies in the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, before coming to Cleveland, Darnell was an education coordinator at Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian's Design Museum, where he organized programming for advanced design audiences and adults, including the museum's first virtual and best attended symposium, Fashion, Culture, Futures, African American Ingenuity, Activism, and Storytelling. Prior to Cooper Hewitt, Darnell worked at an array of institutions in New York City, including the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology and the Costume Institute of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where as a Muse intern, he helped research the fantastic 2018 exhibition, Heavenly Bodies, Fashion and the Catholic. Yes, we loved that, didn't we? Didn't we love that show? Everybody in the front was going, oh! Fashion and the Catholic Imagination. He also taught at the Fashion Institute of Technology's master's program in fashion design, fortifying emerging designers with the historical knowledge they require to pursue fruitful careers. As a curator, Darnell served as an advisor for the 2021 exhibition Voices of Fashion, Black Couture, Beauty, and Styles at the Centraal Museum in Utrecht, the Netherlands, and was the sole fashion historian on the curatorial team for Willie Smith Street Couture at the Cooper Hewitt. He has published extensively on numerous academic and mainstream platforms, including the Fashion and Race Database, Cultured Magazine, and Teen Vogue. He contributed a chapter on Jay Jaxon to the book Black Designers in American Fashion, which is available tonight upstairs in the museum shop. After this program, Darnell will be delighted to sign copies just outside the theater. Darnell holds 3 degrees from the Fashion Institute of Technology, an MA in Fashion and Textile Studies, History, Theory, Museum Practice, a BS in Art History and Museum Professions, and an AAS in Fashion Merchandising. Please join me in welcoming Darnell-Jamal Lisby.
It's so funny when you hear about yourself, you're like, oh, I did that? I did. Thank y'all so much for coming and supporting, and from Elizabeth Way, who actually is the editor of this particular book that I wrote the chapter about Jay Jaxon for. She wants to extend her thank you to everyone. She's currently the associate curator of costumes at the museum at FIT. So if you're, and actually just to put in a little plug for old girl, they're opening up exhibition in the spring about hip hop and celebrating its 50th anniversary of hip hop, if you're familiar with that lineage. So, and I know Dapper Dan is very much heavily involved, so it's going to be a moment to say the least. But to today's business. She reached out to all of us, all different scholars, different academics, to obviously contribute a chapter about someone that we feel connected to. I actually was going to do Dapper Dan, but it was fine. I gave it to someone else. But I decided to do Jay Jaxon because I feel like his story is one that is certainly an unsung story. As a person that grew up on the Unsung television show, talking about all of these different musical figures, right, that they didn't necessarily receive their flowers at the time of their peak, but of course now, maybe later on in life that they are. I feel like Jay Jaxon's having this kind of slight resurgence. I also want to plug in a colleague and peer of mine, Rachel Fenderson, who actually curated curated a very small show on Jay Jaxon, and actually has a lot of contact with his family, and developed quite a bit of research about Jay Jaxon. I believe she might be writing a book about it, so definitely keep your eye on the radar if you love anything about Jay Jaxon's career, and have in the back of your mind to just keep on the lookout for that. But for Jay Jaxon, the story, if you read the chapter at some point, I really kind of move in a way that kind of contextualizes Jay Jaxon. For me, when you're looking at particularly black subjects in fashion, we like to kind of segment them as, oh, they're black designers, they're this. But they were integrated within the fashion system with everyone else. So therefore, why not contextualize them as such, right? If we're going to really kind of illuminate really diverse subjects, particularly black designers, black creatives, black artists, in the same conversations as these individuals that we've, of course, reverenced over, decades and decades, I think it'd be best to have them in that same context. And so, of course, during the 1960s, when Jay Jaxon was beginning his career, because he, I will say, probably started designing professionally circa about 1965, 1966. He was going to school around that time, and then he started to get commissions right around 1966, 67, that were, that he sold some of his own apparel for Henri Bendel and a few of the other kind of major New York department stores. So during that time, obviously, as we all know, definitely go see the exhibition, if you haven't today, about, Princess Grace, and of course, Dior. And so with that said, during that time period, you of course have all these emerging designers that were certainly taking over Paris and really kind of amplifying this new perspective that we'd really I think take for granted in today's perspective, because certainly a lot of contemporary designers, I see a lot of them, particularly a lot of their aesthetics really kind of point to people like Paco Rabanne or people like Pierre Cardin, as well as Marc Bohan or Balenciaga, and really kind of seeing that a little more exaggerated, and of course for the more contemporary eye for a lot of the recent designers. But during this time, how they push the boundaries of fashion is something interesting. But then also in the creative spaces, particularly someone like Diana Vreeland, right, and what she was doing for Vogue, and I think also kind of reimagining and pushing the imagination of what fashion can be and how it's presented. And it's something that we see in Jay Jaxon's career a lot. And I think this is another aspect of this kind of cultural intersections that we see. And I think there's like an intention of really kind of, again, pushing the imagination by way of all the different cultural experiences these designers are having, and really inducing that within their aesthetics. But they are taking the lead of someone like a Diana Vreeland. She was leading the charge in terms of the visual acumen, because of course they weren't only designing in a practical way for people, but they were designing for the presentation of fashion. And that's where we kind of get into that conversation today with Jay Jaxon, because with his legacy, because I'm a person, I like to keep it honest, I speak truth to power, okay. With that said, he had a very successful career, but in terms of his design acumen, it was definitely, I'll say, probably in the middle, right? He wasn't necessarily, and I think and I don't think that there's good or bad. I think there's just the facts and the truth, right? You have designers that are seen as very much high art and high artistic presentation. Then you have other designers that are creating clothes that are a little more for, everybody and every day. And I think that that's okay. And that's what makes the fashion system the way it is. And then with that said, of course, you can't really talk about American fashion without talking about good old Eleanor Lambert, right? If you're not unfamiliar with Eleanor Lambert, she is the reason American fashion is American fashion. She was the American fashion publicist, and she is the reason New York Press Week during the 1940s came about, which was the precursor to New York Fashion Week. Obviously, during the war, World War II, America, which typically got most of their fashions from Paris, was cut off, obviously, because of the war. And so Eleanor Lambert scrambling, it's like, how do we get fashion? How would he make fashion? Instead of sending our buyers, well, they can't go to Paris. Well, she created and really kind of put forward and brought the designer from behind the studio and behind the workers into the front as celebrities themselves. And she's the mind behind Halston, behind Oscar de la Renta, behind Stephen Burrows, behind Jay Jaxon, because it was her that actually told Jay to rename his name, because he was born Eugene Jackson, and that wasn't sexy. So Eleanor was like, change it. And so he's like, I like Jay Jackson, and she was like, go for it. So like that's this conversation. So Eleanor really had a hand in really shaping his career early on, and a lot of the young designers. And I don't think that Eleanor Lambert gets a lot of credit, because what I think is probably the next slide here, or actually two more slides, we'll skip, we'll go back to the other one, but she doesn't get enough credit, in really kind of being a really arbiter of diversity in fashion during the 1960s, 1970s, and really looking for fresh talent that was beyond what people saw and who were the ringleaders of fashion. And certainly overlapping with Jay Jackson's time in his rise was the 1973 Battle of Versailles event. And so that was really the first time that the American designers really got this public, opening of this public coming out party, really international coming out party in a way. But it was the first time where you saw diversity on the stage, not only from the designers themselves, because you had Anne Klein, the only woman designer, Oscar de la Renta, the only Latino designer present, Stephen Burrows, the only black designer present. You had the League of Black Models, Supermodels, and that was really to see all of those women on stage at one time was certainly just like an eye moment for fashion. And so Eleanor Lambert was behind all of that. And I think that for us to really kind of understand Jay Jaxon, his trajectory, is to understand, all the people that were really involved in how his life eventually became. So I'm going to go backward just a little bit. Of course, you have the rise of Seventh Avenue. As I mentioned, Eleanor Lambert was behind the minds of all these individuals, from obviously Oscar de la Renta, Halston, and Bill Blass. And of course, she had a very close relationship with Bonnie Cashin as well. And I think that, what was interesting with Jay Jackson's career, which you'll see a few of his designs later on in the presentation, is this idea of what is American fashion, defining that. Because I think that that's what us fashion historians and curators are still trying to figure out, because there's a French essence, there's an Italian fashion, there's an English. We can kind of pick it out of a lineup, but really framing what is American fashion is something that we're still working through. Of course, there's the big exhibition at Crystal Bridges now, and then there's the exhibition at the Costume Institute that just closed that are obviously dedicated to American fashion. And I think that here is like a great example of this idea of kind of deconstructing a bit of the kind of ostentatious approach of European fashion, stripping it down and making it easier, but still leaving a little bit of those hints of glamour, leaving those hints of effortlessness within the design itself. And I think that that's something that really unites them, even though obviously these are 4 different designs, they really kind of have the same spirit. And I think that that's the core of what American fashion is and what it's become. And certainly what Jay Jaxon infused within his approach, as he not only started as a couture, started obviously as a designer and then became a couturier and then transitioned into designing on his own. So. And then with that said, I think this is like a good time to kind of stand still for a moment. Of course, you have, again, contextualizing, and all of these with the exception, I'll say, of Anne Lowe, all of these individuals, Eleanor Lambert was behind their careers. It was the woman who was really kind of pushing all of them through to the next level. Someone like Arthur McGee, who started off as Charles James, working with Charles James, eventually went on to start his own line. And he's really kind of one of the first black designers to really strike it out on his own. And it was between him and Jay Jaxon that really kind of were the forefathers of of this kind of generation. Because right after them, you have Stephen Burrows, who finally came out with his line by 1969, 1970. And then you have Willie Smith, of course, during that time period, also rising in 7th Avenue at the time when Jay Jaxon was in Paris, and Willie Smith was working for a company called Digits, a 7th Avenue manufacturing line. And then you have Scott Berry, and then I'm having a brain fog because there's plenty of others as well that were around that time too. But with that said, Black designers were again coming out from behind the scenes and into the front, and they were given opportunities to really kind of show and flex and not be constrained. Because I think that there's also this idea, especially talking about Black designers, that they were under a certain level of constraint and a certain level of kind of social social blockage, really. Because, of course, when you talk about 1970, right, we're only a few years out from the Civil Rights Movement, right? We're speaking truth, right? It's only several years out. Like, Dr. King was just assassinated. You have the Black Panther movement really kind of emerging. You have the Black is Beautiful movement happening. You have someone like Naomi Sims, who's on the cover of Life magazine. All of these things are happening. So with that said, I think that there's this inclination, and it's something that I myself I also got wrapped up into, was trying to make the two relate and make them mean like, oh, these things are happening because, but really that if you talk to a lot of these designers, which I had the opportunity to, well, not all of them, obviously Scott Berry passed away, so did Arthur McGee, but Stephen Burrows, and then I've spoken to Willie Smith's family when I was working on the Willie Smith show, and this idea that these people, they were like, we're doing what we want to do, not because of what's going on in life, we're just doing it because we want to have fun. And so that was their life, is having fun. That's why Stephen Burrows' aesthetic was so colorful and so, flamboyant and so bouncy. It was because he just wanted to feel and have fun. It wasn't a purpose, it wasn't an agenda, it wasn't about, even protest, because he himself didn't even feel in line with what was going on. So I think it has to be case by case. Now, that's not to say that there weren't designers, Black designers during that time, who weren't making clothes in solidarity and protest with the Civil Rights Movement, because there were, absolutely. But to say that, I think that most of the main ones that we talk about today, and around that time, they actually don't feel themselves necessarily the most connected to it. So I think that's extremely important to note. Oh, and of course, we can't forget Ann Lowe either. I mean, someone like Ann Lowe, of course, paved the way for all of these designers even to have a success, because also the reason I put that there, now it's coming back to me, is to even think about this idea of couture, right? And this idea of couture in the process of couture. And so I think that with Ann Lowe and her practice and being able to kind of create an identified look for herself is something that bled into Jay Jaxon's career. And we're going to see that in just a few moments. So from Eugene to Jay, as I mentioned, he was born Eugene Jaxon, okay? He's from Queens, Jamaica, Queens. Shout out to Jamaica if you're familiar. It's a quiet part of New York City if you've ever been. And, from his family, very humbling family. And this is another thing that I've also learned a lot about his life, and very similar to other of his peers like Stephen, as well as Willie Smith and eventually Patrick Kelly, is that they had very supportive families that supported their dreams and careers of being fashion designers. I think that's also another misnomer when it comes to Black designers as well, because, of course, there's the practicality of being a fashion designer, particularly at this time. Was it a money-making move? That's the idea. And of course, when you're thinking about the idea of, Black families at that time and economic disparity and all of those different kind of questions happening, right, that are in the back of your mind, the first inclination is like, were their parents supportive? Oh, they threw them out. They kicked them out. And also, most of them were also gay as well. So that's happening. So they were thrown out to the streets. That's the thought. And it's like, no, they actually all have very supportive families and very lovely families that wanted them to succeed, wanted them to really embark on that that journey of creating clothes, and a lot of them were inspired by their grandmothers, and particularly Jay Jaxon as well had that within his family of the grandmothers and mothers in the family, sewing and introducing him to those tools. Now, for Jay, he wasn't initially like, oh, I want to be a designer growing up. That wasn't his path. That was something that eventually, over time, he wanted to really embark on. At the time, he was in law school and he was a bank teller. And so, he, in the early part of his life, he was actually not thinking about fashion in that very in-depth way. I mean, it was there, but it wasn't like, oh, I want to do this. It was more like a hobby. And so he was going to NYU he went to Hunter College and he went to NYU. And then it was a friend of his. She wanted to go to a party, and he decided to make a costume for her. Or no, a dress. It was a dinner party and a cocktail dress for her. And apparently she got rave reviews. Everybody loved the dress. And then he was like, let me think about this a little bit. And so he also had an affinity for costume design. And so eventually he was like, I think I want to move into that path. So with the money he saved from his job as a bank teller, he left law school. He went to FIT for school as well, and then also did some at the NYU costume design. They had a costume design program there as well. And so for him, he, eventually embarked on that journey. And so he, throughout his career, he did a few costume design commissions when he was in Paris. He eventually came back, and you'll see at the end he did some costume design gigs at the latter part of his career. So it really was almost like a full circle moment in terms of his real passion and his hobby. Well, not hobby, but his passion. And so with that said, he really kind of started obviously networking, and he met someone like a Stephen Burrows. Like, how are you doing this? Where are you going? How are you making these connections in order to get to the next level? And so he decided to meet the right people, including a few kind of Seventh Avenue manufacturer textile companies, and they partnered with him to create his own lines. And so here in the middle, in the corner to the right, I know it's a little small. I wish I had like a bigger photo, but Vogue does not play about, image licensing. So with that said, he created this line of like kimonos. And so this was really kind of like the first time where you see Jay Jaxon's mind really ticking about, these other cultural influences and using them and integrating them within this collection. But then also, again, to the earlier point when I was explaining about the Diana Vreeland, expanding the imagination, bringing people around the world without bringing them around the world, but using the clothes to do it and challenging people's imagination. This is a dress to the right, this is a dress from the late 60s, presumably before he went to Paris. And so this was a design, I don't believe it was a part of the same collection, it was a part of a different commission from my research. But with that said, it's definitely a very kind of seamless 1960s dress, right? With a very kind of cut, like box cut sheath dress. But for him, he was trying to figure out this line and balancing of creating fashion that was for everyone, that more people could be introduced to, but then also creating something that, of course, the higher ups, the hegemony of fashion could really appreciate. And that was really a tightrope that I will have to be honest as a curator. Of course, we have our curatorial opinion, but like, I don't know if he successfully did that. That's something that you can see. That's a push and pull throughout his career. And that's just the honest fact. I don't think it was some seamless thing that we can just put a pinpoint and say, oh, everything was a hit or everything was a success. Because as we see, when he was in Paris, the critics were not necessarily the most favorable of his designs, even though what proof we have of the designs actually look beautiful to me, but the opinion was what he was creating was not necessarily avant-garde. And so I think that has to, those two thoughts have to be said in the same vein. So Jay went to, so of course, Jay Jaxon, he went to Paris in the late 60s. And before he went to Paris, he was reaching out to Givenchy, actually, Uber de Givenchy, and said, hey, could I come over to the atelier? Can I do a visit? And this was very typical of a lot of, designers who were interested in getting into Paris and learning from the big couturiers at the time. It was very regular. If you can get an appointment and get the attention of the couturier and the creative director themselves. And so Jay Jaxon got the attention of Uber de Givenchy. And Rachel, I believe, has like the actual letter that Givenchy said, yeah, come on, whenever you want. This letter expires at a certain time, come within this time period and you're more than welcome to see the practice. Because I think it's the idea that Jay Jaxon had an interest in learning couture techniques because it's very specific, it's very traditional to each and every house. Everyone has a different way of doing things, but I think for Jay Jaxon, for him to really kind of, again, reach that fashion hegemony, that larger crowd, and really kind of appease them in that direct way, he had to learn from them. And so the timeline is very murky. But I will say that for the most part, he, before and after his time at Jean-Louis Chialet, which is where he eventually ascended as the house's creative director, artistic director, for a short period of time, he was bouncing around as an assistant designer. He was an assistant designer for Yves Saint Laurent, as well as for Jean-Louis Chialet, right before he ascended into the spot as artistic director, and then of course for Marc Bohan as well. And so, is there definitive proof? The family says it, everybody says it. I went to Dior myself in all of the houses, and definitely they are perplexed. I'm perplexed. It's proof. There's proof there, and there is recorded evidence that he was at those houses. But the houses themselves, tricky. And so, the Parisians, we love them, right? And so, with that said, there is evidence, written evidence, that he was at those houses being an assistant designer and working for them for short stints of time. And learning from there, and what we'll get into a little bit later, is that he used those techniques while he was striking it on his own, and doing his own commissions and doing his own lines, ready-to-wear lines, in Paris and trying to sell there. I don't think they were as successful, but it definitely was a great setup for someone like Patrick Kelly, who eventually came along, who obviously was eventually inducted to the Chambre Syndicale du Prêt-à-Porter in 1988. So I think that, even though it didn't necessarily work for Jay Jaxon in the larger big picture of his career, he is a foundation for so many that came right after him. And so at Jean-Louis Chialet, so he, again, was an assistant designer. And to give you a little backstory how it happened. So this is where, unfortunately, the shady part comes in. And so Jean-Louis Chialet, obviously, he worked for Dior, and then decided to strike it out on his own. And because Yves Saint Laurent got the job, and Jean-Louis was not happy. And so, not my problem. And so Jean-Louis decided to start his own brand. He partnered with one of the Rockefeller relatives has a financier company, and they financed Jean-Louis Chialet. They had a conflict, Jean-Louis and the financial company, the backers. And so they decided, the backers wanted Jean-Louis to actually go ahead and start doing ready-to-wear lines, as ready-to-wear was starting to become a thing. Obviously, Yves Saint Laurent, again, his mortal enemy, was doing ready-to-wear with the Rive Gauche line. And so the backers were like, oh, it's making money, we got to do this. And Jean-Louis like, no. And so the backers are, at this point, basically exiled him. They were like, you can't work here anymore. We're going to take over. So they actually kind of were forcing him out. Jean-Louis said, no, my name's on the top billing. It's my company. So they were in a legal battle. But the show must go on. And so the backers were like, well, Jay Jaxon knows all the tricks of the trade. Why don't we have him design while this is all happening? And so they had Jay Jaxon become they appointed him as the artistic director. And so Jay Jaxon was the artistic director from 1969 to 1970. So again, a very kind of short window, but a window nonetheless. And so with the Jean-Louis Chillet Spring Summer 1970 collection, that was like the first like really kind of ready to wear show. These are sketches of the designs that he produced. Obviously, they're not obviously the physical photographs of the physical fashions, but even in the sketches themselves, I think it shows, certainly where his mind was, again, with that kind of mass appeal, the youth effect, really kind of all of these different like sheath, very long, linear fashions that were also kind of electric with the polka dots and definitely color blocking. And so it was just this fusion of youth, his inspiration from youth culture that was happening at the time. And so I think that unfortunately for the reviews, they were saying not so nice things. They were really kind of basically saying that it was more or less some of the same that they were seeing. But with that said, I don't necessarily feel it's a bad thing, because at the end of the day, it kept the business around. It sold, which means it was a success, on a financial level. So from an art level, but from a financial place, it worked. And I think that that's a very interesting kind of toe the line, particularly around designers of color around this time period when they were jumping from house to house to house, back in the United States, or doing their own thing. They were keeping a lot of companies in business because they knew creating fashion that reached the masses, that really touched people in that really direct way, was the path to success. Because now here we are in the 21st century. It's pretty, obviously we have mass fashion and budget fashion that is really kind of like a strong foundational point of the fashion system that makes a lot of the money for what obviously creatives are able to do at the top of the food chain. So with that said, I think Jay Jaxon was a bit ahead of his time. And then also thinking a little bit, about his inspirations. I believe there's not much recorded evidence of which is which. I believe to your right, is from the spring 1970 line, but I believe to the left are things from his couture, from the couture show that he did, the spring 1970 couture show he did. And so I think that what's so fascinating about different photos that I've seen of, fashions that I think are from the couture show on the left, are very much the inspiration of India. And we see this, and it's something that I've visited, particularly with Willie Smith, because Willie Smith loved and adored India. He even set up his first factory in India, and that's how he made his business. So a lot of his fashions are inspired by that. But we see this in a lot of particularly Black designers. See it with Arthur McGee's work. I see it a little bit with Stephen Burrows' work. And so I think it's fascinating, that conversation between designers in general. Also, Diane von Furstenberg, certainly the wrap dress itself was inspired by the sari. So there's this interesting conversation in the 1960s between American fashion designers and Indian cultural dress. And so I think with Jay Jaxon fitting in this conversation makes it all the more easy to contextualize how what he was creating was certainly of a high appeal during that period. And then when he was on his own, in the center, these are a pair of jodhpurs, obviously also another kind of reference to Indian dress. And so, long story short, John Louis won the case in the financial backers law. So the financial backers had to leave. John Louis came back in. Jay Jaxon kind of faded behind the scenes as the assistant designer, I think, for a bit of time. And then after that, he decided to go and bounce around as assistant designer to the other couturiers, as I mentioned earlier. And then he decided to do his own line while he was in Paris. And these are two different designs to the left from the same collection. He was thinking about doing menswear and women's wear. And so that was also pretty irregular at the time, because because most designers were just primarily doing women's wear. The men's wear that was happening, that was there, but mostly men were going to tailors and going to tailor shops and getting their clothes custom made. It was very much still in tradition. But to say the least, creating like a whole men's line, I believe Givenchy was like one of the first designers to really kind of have a separate line for menswear. And so for Jay Jaxon to really kind of embark on that mission really shows where his mind was working, and also to create things that were in this ilk of gender neutrality. Certainly during the 1960s and 70s, that was the call for the day, right? And so, for him, he wanted to mix the two. He wanted to have something that women could wear, but men could also partake in as well, as you can see with the kind of like the peace sign ensembles to the left. And so for Jay Jaxon, this was all like a fun adventure for him to really kind of experience what he was doing at all of these different houses as an assistant designer, then take it to the next level at Jean-Louis Cheret as the artistic director, and then kind of strike it on his own. It really kind of shows the consistency of him developing his work, and also the refinement of his work. As you can see in the previous one, this is certainly like to the left, a far cry from, the kimono that he did, before he left New York. And so it's something that, again, that refinement, something that he was trying to take away from his time in Paris. And then, of course, eventually he would come back to the United States, which he did in 1973, 4. And so that's something that we see, that refinement within his design. And it's more sleek, it's more seamless and not bulky. It's very just kind of easy and effortless. And also the materials that he's choosing, I think, is also very important as well. He's transitioning to more wools and using more kind of softer wools instead of using more boiled wools or something of that nature. Things that are just easy and just kind of look like butter on the body. So post-Paris. So again, eventually he came back to the United States around 1970, in 1973, beginning of 1974. And, he wanted to know what's next. What is he going to do? And so he decided to continue working on his own line. And he began to also work for other brands as well, which you'll see in a second. But on the left, that long dress, it's probably a silk-like dress. I don't know if it's actually silk, probably polyester. Dress in the center with the plunging neckline. That's his design that WWD featured. So certainly 1974, right in the middle, right in the beginning, really kind of that burgeoning disco, that disco moment. So he's really kind of taking advantage of that and applying, of course, again, that refinement that he learned in Paris into what he was designing in the United States of America. To the right at the top, in the article to the right, at the top left, are his designs as well. Again, he was trying to create this seamless balance because I think he realized when he came back to New York, people aren't buying those kind of high, kind of like glossy, Indian-inspired fashions. They want something easy that they can easily kind of switch out from season to season. And that's a lot of what his peers were really kind of understanding, because a few of them, including Jay Jaxon, wanted to kind of create that high art, really push American fashion in that way. And they were all kind of in cahoots on it, actually, because they did communicate with one another about their design and what they were doing and what they were going to kind of create next. But I think there was this reality of if they're going to sell on 7th Avenue and sell to the mass markets, they have to kind of bring it down. And I think this goes back to the earlier point of what is American fashion and what is going to sell for the public or to the public. And so here is these kind of Vogue dresses. These are from the exact same collection. So at the top, I showed at the previous article from the top right, those kind of beautiful dresses. Here they are in real time. in this Vogue editorial. So they were, of course, made for, kind of like that cruise resort kind of essence, very effortless. And so for him, this is something that, again, that he wanted to not necessarily expound on what he learned in Paris, but kind of create a new path for himself and really kind of define what is the Jay Jaxon style, what is the Jay Jaxon look. Because if we see from the kimono, which was obviously like this boxy, lots of fabric, and then we move to Paris where you see his designs for Jean-Louis Chirac that still, of course, clothe a lot of fabric, swathing of fabric, but then here you see things that are a little more refined in terms of the cut, in terms of the silhouette, that I think kind of speak to who he is, and of course kind of creating a little bit of sensuality with his clothing. He loved that. He enjoyed that, of course, with the plunging neckline example. And then you see this, is something that he wanted to allow women to feel, free in what they were wearing. And certainly during the 1970s, that was like, that was rule number one, to create fashions that allowed women to feel free, to feel their most empowered, but then also kind of to be angelic in a way as well. And so during this time period, it was interesting because this is very practical in terms of a lot of designers, not just black designers, but a lot of designers, they bounce from manufacturing company to manufacturing company to manufacturing company. Some of them, of course, striked it out on their own, started their own brand with their own eponymous label, and they've been able to have great success. But others, like a Jay Jaxon, they kind of bounced around, and he went to Pierre Cardin, New York, so he worked for the New York he ran the New York faction of Pierre Cardin, which was obviously a licensed label under the Pierre Cardin Paris. And then he eventually went to Pliers. And so for Jay, to the left, actually, he does this entire Indian inspired. So again, he's bringing back those inspirations, really kind of drawing back what he learned in Paris and bringing it into this American kind of way. To the left is this editorial. It's actually a page out of this larger editorial in Essence magazine called The First People's Designer. So it was this entire editorial of all the big black the most famous, most notable black designers at the time. And he was featured. And I think that's extremely poignant that he was selected to be amongst all of these other designers. And so even though, of course, today his story I feel like is so unsung, at the time people did reverence him, they did love him, they did love what he was bringing to the table, because it was a nice balance of pushing the imagination but then also practicality of fashion. And then this design is definitely a pure example from this beautiful kind of cape coat, and then of course the Jodhpur pants. And so it's like this ease of extra but enough that you can kind of take the different pieces from the blouse to the coat and wear them separately but put it together. And it was just the ease that he was really kind of introducing into the fashion sphere. And certainly with Pliers, there was a particular market, particular segment, that youth segment that he was really targeting with Pliers and really kind of rebranding them. And I don't think he gets enough credit for going into houses like the Pierre Cardin New York or Pliers or Jean-Louis Chirac and really kind of looking at youth culture and really kind of looking forward of like, they're the future, so why don't we try to create fashions that dress them, that not only dress them but address them. And so for him, that's what he did throughout a lot of his career, as you can see with these kind of like Ivy style clothes that he produced during this period. And then costume designing, he did some things. So, his life, after, I'll say roughly late 70s, he decided to kind of take a back seat, and he decided to work on some different costume design projects over the years. These are just three of different shows that he's either made designs for or was assigned as a costume designer to be temporarily or for the entire project, Ally McBeal being one of them. He made a few dresses for Sabrina, the Teenage Witch, for that show, particularly also the cat as well. He made some of their costumes. And then he designed a few of the dresses for Mr. and Mrs. Smith, starring these two. Not going into that. I have no opinions on anything involving that. But with that said, and also, again, in Paris, he was also doing a few costume design commissions, I believe, for a few ballets there. And so for Jay Jaxon, this was home for him. He felt really at home doing costume designing, being behind in the background. And I think that was also probably the push and pull of his career. I think he really enjoyed being in the background, but with American fashion and really trying to make it on par with Europe, you kind of had to do the opposite. The designer has to be the face. That's a part of the marketing, and that's just what it is. And I think for him, he loved being behind the scenes. He loved kind of being the support. And so this is what he did. And then, of course, when did he pass away? I forgot the year he passed away. But, this was the last few commissions that he did. And so looking at, his legacy and context, again, going back to the idea of contextualizing, is something that I'm always thinking about. Where does Jay Jaxon fit in this kind of larger story, particularly around Black designers, if we're going to talk about them and really give them a voice and give these designers their flowers? Someone like Patrick Kelly, who've written extensively about, is someone that I was thinking about. Of course, as I mentioned, his stint in Paris, even though it wasn't long, it certainly established what then would become an extremely successful career by Patrick Kelly, who was inducted as the first American designer to be inducted into the Chambre Syndicale du Prêt-à-Porter, there hasn't been an American. I think Ralph Rucci is the only American who was inducted in the couture faction of it, if I'm not mistaken. But certainly Patrick Kelly was designing well before Ralph. But then, of course, you had, again, Stephen Burrows in 1973 being the only Black designer present at the Battle of Versailles. But then you have Willie Smith as the first Black designer to have, a multi-million-dollar brand, at the time. But by the time he passed away in 1987, his brand was shelling out $25 million in sales, which was unheard of, for a Black designer. And then, of course, he was trailblazing alongside Dapper Dan, who was in Harlem. They did not have intersections, I ask. They did not meet. The two did not meet. One was uptown, one was downtown. And that was just the lives they lived. They knew of each other, but they weren't friends. But they were both trailblazing the past of contemporary streetwear that we all live in and eat, breathe, that the fashion industry breathes today. But then also thinking about what happened thereafter, right? You're looking at all of these different these kind of really major moments. In a way, of course, you're just like, oh, why all these firsts? And why can't it just be? But at the end of the day, this is just the world we live in. And I think celebrating the victories and the wins when they're there is something that we should give credit to bring awareness so that we can stop having all these firsts and just have what is, so that we can just have a very kind of cross-cultural conversation where everybody has a voice, no matter what color, race, or creed you come from. I'm thinking about Al Fadi being, one of the first African designers to really kind of show in Paris in 1985 and 1987. You have Azo Boateng being appointed as the menswear creative director for Givenchy in 2004. Olivier Rousteing for Balmain in 2009. Virgil Abloh, obviously, he just passed away, being the first men's Black, the first Black individual to be appointed the head of Louis Vuitton menswear in 2018. Then you have Rihanna with her Fenty line, being the first Black woman to ever kind of partner with a major luxury conglomerate to start her own brand and collection. Of course, that shuttered its doors recently, but to say the least, it was a try. It wasn't a success, but to say the least, LVMH never closes down the brand. They just kind of put it out in commission. They might revive it. Who's to say? You have Imani Ayisi, who eventually became the first. He was asked to be a guest member of the Chambre Syndicale de la Haute Couture in 2020, so he shows. And then you have Kirby John Raymond, who was asked last year to show in Couture Week for spring for fall winter couture week, which is in the summer to 2021. And Maximilian Davis, who recently is appointed the helm of Ferragamo, and had his first showing recently this past fashion week. So you have all of these things happening, and I don't think they could have happened without someone like a Jay Jaxon doing trial and error, right? Like, again, as I mentioned, I wanted to be upfront, speak truth to power. His career, solid. But was his designs avant-garde? I wouldn't say, but were they consistent? Yes. Were they attractive to a particular customer? Absolutely. He had his own fan base that loved him and followed him. So I think that that's something important to note. But to say the least, all of that had to happen for all of this to happen as well. And so it's one of those, where do we go from here? This idea as a fashion curator, I always think, like, what's the point, right? Why do we do this? And so I think it's to do things like this. My dear friend Christine Chakingska in London curated the Africa Fashion Show that's on now. And I believe, quiet as kept, it might be traveling here to the States, so keep your eyes out open. But, to show, the power of fashion and how it's, like, really not only expanding, but all of these different stories that are being told that deserve a space, amongst, the greats like a Marc Bohan or Yves Saint Laurent or Pierre Cardin. Everyone has a story to tell through clothing, and I think that's something that we should always keep in the back of our minds. But that's it. That's my presentation.
Thank you, Darnell, for a wonderful presentation. We have time for a few questions from the audience. My name is Rebecca Singer, and I have the privilege of serving as the voice of our Zoom audience. Well, yes. For those of you in the theater, please wait for my colleague Alex to pass you the microphone so everyone, guests in the theater, the speaker, and the folks tuning in from home can hear you. And once you've asked your question, please return the microphone to Alex. And while Alex is walking over to a speaker, an audience member, I will start with our first question from Zoom, which is, did Black designers find a better support system to build their brand and following in France or in the US? And how did French couture respond to Black designers?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think it was one or the other. I think we have to look at the fashion industry as like one big old bubble instead of looking at it as like Europe. Of course, we have our differences. Like I said, the French, they're the French. But to say the least, I don't think whatever worked best for that individual designer, they found their support. And as long as that they were authentic about who they were and authentic about what, design they were going to put out in the atmosphere, they found that success. So, of course, Patrick Kelly found success in Paris because if you understand a lot of his design, it really his primary inspiration is Josephine Baker. So he felt akin to Josephine, this idea of feeling exiled or not being welcomed by my own people, but I get love in France. And so that's why you see a lot of that, and that's why he found success over there in that way. I mean, it didn't hurt to also, Josephine's now like of course, like a French icon, even though she's American. It's this idea that it's this that you find support wherever you can, and I think it just depends on where. It was case by case, and from what I know, the Parisian designers weren't bothered about anybody. I don't even think it mattered about your color. They were in their own world. They don't care if you were black or blue or orange. They were like, we're French, so we're better. Yeah, that was that. Yeah, like like they don't care. Like it's interesting. They like even I don't want to say to this day, but like their attitude is we're French, we're Parisian, we're French. We don't care. But I will say, Stephen Burrows, Yves Saint Laurent apparently blushed when he saw Stephen Burrows' designs at the Ballad of Versailles. So, I think he had an admiration for American designers, Black American designers, maybe possibly. And so, it's case by case. I can't speak for every single French couturier, but yeah.
Okay, we have a question from the audience here.
Yeah.
Darnell, what a great job you've done in
Thanks,
terms of
Elaine.
placing Jay Jackson's legacy in context with designers, period. So excellent job. Thank you so much. I actually have 6 questions, but I'm only going to ask one.
You got my email, so don't worry.
And it's only it's a simple question.
Sure.
In terms of his label, do you have images of his label?
Wow, it's tricky. Rachel Fenderson, I believe, has some images of the label that he did, and it was very short-lived. I don't think it was, years and years. I think he started it in Paris. He was doing it kind of back and forth, and then it into when he moved back into the United States, and then it just kind of collapsed and folded. But the Jodhpurs, that was his. Let me go back. No, that wasn't.
Yeah, I
it.
remember the picture.
Oh,
and
yeah.
one of the things in terms of doing research, oftentimes you don't see the labels. That
Oh,
they
right,
create.
the
Yes,
labels.
yes.
No, I don't have a picture of the label, but I don't know. I don't even know if she does, to say the least. But yeah, it's one of those kind of lost in history things. But
Well, thank you for resurrecting his legacy.
of course.
How often do you have a problem when you get to the transitions stage of interpreting into fabric? It seems like these dresses and garments fall so beautifully.
Sure. I mean, you're talking about when they are like in the process of designing the actual clothes
When they actually get created from your designs.
Well, I think, the process, it just depends from house to house. Usually at a place like a Jean-Louis Chalet, they have their own kind of tailleur staff. Like it's a whole atelier of people that understand what fabrics work on, what fabrics work best for them. And I think that obviously for Jean-Louis Chalet, if you see a lot of his designs, wool, it seems to be a primary approach to a lot of his fabrics. So that's what they're going to go towards first, and then try to like maneuver certain silhouettes that will work with that particular fabrication. And of course, when you think about an atelier, they have tons of toiles, which are like the examples, like the really kind of like the first step in designing, right? After you do the illustration, you create the toile, you put it on the mannequin, and then you match the fabric to see what works. And so a lot of the times the toile, some, work, some don't, and they just throw it away into, lost into history. You never see it again. And so I think it just depends on the situation, and it depends on the house, because every house is different. When you think about Dior and how they move, particularly, of course, silk satins is very much in their very consistent within their history. And so with that said, they work with a lot of silhouettes that will allow silk satin to really kind of shine, or silk Georgette as well, to shine. That's just a part of the process of designing. So it just depends. It's trial and error.
Thank you.
One more question.
And I
here
think
from
this
the
is going to be
audience.
our last question for the evening.
Okay.
I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
And I was really intrigued when you mentioned dance design. And I was wondering if you could share with us, was there a particular dance company that embraced him as a costume designer, or a particular choreographer? Do you know anything about what he did within the dance world?
Not particularly. I mean, I know that I believe he did a few kind of off-Broadway, like he designed for some off-Broadway companies, and he was very much involved with the Avenue, but a lot of the black designers were, Willie Smith was, Stephen Burrows was, they all had a lot of overlap with a lot of those companies and dance troupes in New York. But ideally, I don't know any specific ones, but certainly he just had an affinity for getting his hands on any project that he could. And certainly I'm just taking like a snapshot of his very long life and resume. But with that said, yeah, like there wasn't one particular troupe that he was like associated with or partnered with. It was just really kind of sprinkled throughout his entire career. Yeah, of course. So
I think we've run out of time for questions, so many thanks to Darnell Lisby for his fabulous presentation.
thank you.
And thank you to all of you in the audience who joined us here at Hillwood, well as those of you tuning in from home. For those of you who are on site, please know that Darnell will be signing the book Black Designers in American Fashion right at the desk right outside the theater doors in just a few moments. And I invite everyone to come join us for our next lecture in 2 weeks on Wednesday, November 9th, Cartier and Islamic Art. So thank you all, and have a good night.
Did you design it?